Dan Lewis, glad to be with you. We are looking now at lecture number 6, which begins 2 lectures actually that are going to deal with translation theory, lecture 6 and lecture 7. I mentioned in the last lecture that there was 2 kinds of big areas that we need to consider in Bible translation. One was the text itself, what is the original text, and the other is the method by which we transfer that text from one language to another. So in this lecture and the next lecture, we want to talk about method, which is the way that we go about getting languages between 2 theoretical poles. There are 2 words that you need to be familiar with. One is called formal equivalence and one is called functional equivalence. Formal equivalence means simply word for word or literal translation. Formal equivalence would be, if you do it in the strictest way, is just simply take one Greek word and translate it into one English word, or one Hebrew word and translate it into one English word. But because of grammatical differences, this is not always possible. So that brings us to functional equivalence, sometimes also called dynamic equivalency or concept for concept translation. Functional equivalence is a way of translating into a second language that does not worry so much about a word for word approach as much as a meaning for meaning approach, and takes much more into account things like idiomatic language that we talked about earlier. So let me give you some examples of this so you can kind of see what we're talking about. In formal equivalence, the method works to stay as close as reasonable to the form of the original language. In the earlier example I gave from Philemon, where Paul uses the word intestine, we noted that the New International Version actually uses the word heart. And this is not a formal equivalence. If we were going to do formal equivalence, we would have to say if Paul said intestine, then we're going to have to say intestine. So formal equivalence does try to stick as close as possible, but sometimes that can obscure the meaning, and so it's not perfect in every case. But translators do try to find, in as far as is reasonable, a single word in the second language to represent a single word in the original language. They also try to retain the syntax of the original language to a considerable degree. That is not always possible either, because in some languages verbs drive the sentence, and in other languages subjects or nouns drive the sentence. But insofar as it is reasonably possible, they try to maintain the syntax. And the more translations tend toward formal equivalence, the more the reader is expected to be familiar with ancient culture and idiomatic language, because they're not explaining idiomatic language, they're not trying to find a different idiom, they're trying to go word for word. And so you need to be aware of idioms in order to understand what the text is going to say. Now, there are a number of formal equivalent translations that tend toward this word for word approach. And these are some of the major ones. The King James Version of the Bible from 1611, the American Standard Version from 1901, the Revised Standard Version from 1952, the New American Standard Bible from 1960, the New King James Version of the Bible, which is a revision, obviously, as it would seem to be, of the King James Version, the modernizing of its language, and then the English Standard Version, which was produced not many years ago in 2001. Now let me give you some formal equivalence examples. The King James Version translates this passage in 1 Kings 21 this way. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and I will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall. Now for many modern people, this is sort of culturally awkward. People tend not to want to read this aloud in church because it seems to be culturally awkward. Because it uses this expression at the end of the sentence, an expression that typically we don't use in modern parlance. And since this is pretty much exactly what the Hebrew text says, this translation expects the reader to be familiar with the idiomatic language of Hebrews, that him who pisseth against the wall is a way of talking about male descendants. Here is another example. This one is in 1 Samuel 24, and this is from the American Standard Version. He came to the sheepcotes by the way where it was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet. Not a few people have read this passage in the American Standard Version, and it's very close to the same way in the King James Version, which is more or less a word for word of the Hebrew text. But they have decided that when Saul went in to cover his feet, he probably went in to take a nap. Maybe he had a little blanket with him, or maybe he had some other kind of covering, and so he covered himself up and took a nap. What they don't know is that the expression to cover the feet is a well-known Hebrew euphemism for relieving yourself. And so the translation, even though it is word for word, doesn't give you all the information you would need to know to actually understand what Paul was doing in this cave. So in this way, formal equivalence is a word for word translation, but expects a lot more of the reader. The reader has to supply some knowledge to get around these various kinds of idioms. The risk of formal equivalence is that readers who don't understand ancient idioms and syntax may actually misinterpret passages. And they may attribute to them a modern meaning that is different than the ancient meaning. And this actually can happen in translations that are not updated, where they have archaic English that isn't updated to modern English. But the risk is high for formal equivalence in this regard. That doesn't mean they're bad translations, but it does mean it requires more of you as the reader. Now we come to translation theory part 2. Here we want to look at functional equivalence. This method tries to maintain the meaning of the original language, but putting it into an idiom in the second language so that we say the same way in the second language, the way that the people who are reading this would probably say it. A single word in the original language sometimes might require several words in the second language to express that very idea. Or a metaphor in Greek, for instance, might require a different metaphor in the second language. The more a translator tends toward functional equivalence, the less the reader has to be familiar with ancient culture and idiomatic language. But at the same time, even though you don't have to be as familiar with ancient culture and idiomatic language, you are much more dependent upon the translator to give you the right idiom. So there are risks with that as well. Functional equivalent translations, and there are quite a number of them in modern English, most of them in the 20th century or the early part of the 21st century, and here are half a dozen of them. The New Testament in Modern English by J.B. Phillips. He began producing these as little sections of the letters of Paul, but eventually completed the entire New Testament, and Phillips was a scholar from Oxford, England. The Good News Bible, which formerly was called Today's English Version, produced in 1966. The New English Bible, which was produced at Cambridge University. The Living Bible, which is a paraphrase Bible by the American evangelical named Kenneth Taylor. And then a very popular modern language edition called The Message by Eugene Peterson, which was released in 2002. And then even more recently, the Good as New Bible in Great Britain in 2004. Let me give you some functional equivalent examples. This is one from The Message, Eugene Peterson, 2 Timothy 4:3. He says, you're going to find that there will be times when people will have no stomach for solid teaching. They will fill up on spiritual junk food, catchy opinions that tickle their fancy. Did Paul know about spiritual junk food? Well, probably not, but that's sort of the way we would say it in modern English. There's nothing in the Greek text that corresponds to spiritual junk food, but still, it is an idiom that we would use in modern English, so Eugene Peterson has used it. The risk, of course, is that in functional equivalence translations, the translator can more easily inject his biases into the translations. He might not do this intentionally, and maybe in some cases he doesn't intentionally, but readers will be unaware of these biases. And so that brings us to the end of Lecture 6. When we start Lecture 7, I want to talk about the third part of translation theory, which is a balance between these two polarities, functional equivalence and formal equivalence. This is the end of Lecture 6.